Hey now, welcome back to The Exchange with KB. This is your host, Kirill speaking. The Exchange with KB is where you get to know interesting people and their thoughts on entrepreneurship, building and scaling businesses, success and failure, and much, much more. If you enjoyed this episode, go to my website, KirillBensonoff.com, and sign up for occasional updates. I'd like to introduce Keith Cline, the guest on today's episode. Keith is the founder of VentureFizz, the go-to resource for tech news and jobs in Boston and New York. Hey, Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome, man. Glad to have you. So, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So, I have my own podcast, so this is interesting. This is the first time I've been on the other side of the table, so thanks again. So my background, let's see, I started my career actually as a tax consultant for KPMG, which was a lot of fun, great firm, learned a ton, but tax consulting wasn't kind of my thing. So I ended up landing in the recruiting industry. I was looking to get into the tech industry, was exploring opportunities in software sales, but not having a sales background, it was pretty tough to land something in that capacity. So a friend of mine was working at a staffing firm that was just starting a team that was focused on hiring people out of the Big Five at the time. So my background was a good fit, and the job was to help recruit people out of those firms, so the management consulting practices of Deloitte and KPMG and Accenture at the time, and place them at companies. So this was '98 when the Internet 1.0 bubble was just starting to blossom. So that was kind of how I got into the whole startup industry, was helping that era of companies staff up. So I did that for 4 years, and then after the economic downturn happened, the search firm I was working for, didn't have any interest in working with startups anymore because there really was little business to be had there. But it's what my passion was. So I went off and started my own search firm called Dissero. So we were a boutique. It was a 3-person firm for a good stretch. We kind of worked our way up through the contingency ranks to becoming more of a quasi-retained search firm, helping venture-backed companies in Boston hire talent in product management and marketing. And then VentureFizz was an offshoot of Dissero, just me being a dialed-in recruiter. I was always keeping tabs on who's raising capital, what events you should go to, and of course, who's hiring. So that's information I used to share with candidates on a conversation-by-conversation basis, when I just realized that maybe this information would be a lot more valuable if it was on a website. So I started VentureFizz in 2009. Right after the economic collapse. There really wasn't a lot of search work to be had then. So, this idea of VentureFizz I put into play and built out the website and launched it and kept up with it for all those years, still running my search firm kind of as a side hustle until about 2 years ago, really focused on, scaling VentureFizz to what it is today, as well as, putting my search firm on hold.
Nice, man. Congratulations. So you're all in, and it's 10 years running a business. That's pretty impressive in itself.
Yeah, it was 15 years running the search firm. And then, it's been, VentureFizz has been around for almost 10 years now, but 2 years of the core business that it is today. Before that, it was still a lot of the features and functionality of what the website is, but certainly not as robust.
Yeah, I got to say, I've read VentureFizz and I've looked at the job postings for quite a while. So I've been a long time supporter / reader. Let me ask you, what do you think? Like, what's the biggest differentiator of VentureFizz? If we think about the recruiting side of it, because it's not just recruiting, right? There's news and all kinds of other stuff, informational content and whatnot. That's very interesting as well. So, but what's the biggest thing that separates you from like Indeed or another job board?
Great question. At the simplest form, VentureFizz, the value we add is connecting amazing talent to amazing companies through employment branding and job posting. So that's the core to our business, and that kind of stems from my background as a recruiter. But I think the content that we publish is a huge differentiator. Like Indeed doesn't have stories of companies. Other sites, same thing, where our content is heavily geared towards providing our audience an inside look at a company, their people, and culture. So sometimes we do get confused as being a news outlet, but we certainly are not that, not aiming to be that. There probably was a little stretch of time when I started digging dipping my toes into the content world, that we were doing stuff that was more newsy oriented. But since then we've perfected our content strategy that is largely more of a digital magazine format. So if you go through the stories section of VentureFizz, you're going to see a lot of profiles on companies, people, an inside look of how their engineering team operates or their culture. Office tours are very popular, so we publish those every single week. So I think it's the cadence of our content that adds a lot of value to the site. Plus, it's a community, so we heavily support the Boston and New York tech communities. So we are there to help enable and hopefully support it so that companies continue to do some great things. Then last is it's just so specific. So I knew as a recruiter, if there was a job board that had a very narrow audience, that there's tremendous value there. So that's what led me to help to start the site to begin with. So people that are in the Boston tech scene, whether if you're a software engineer, user experience professional, product manager, salesperson, et cetera, you can go to VentureFizz and find jobs specific to your industry in the general location of where you live.
Nice. That's awesome. And you certainly do great content as well. I mean, I was just looking at your podcast section, and you interview some very interesting people and fairly frequently also. What's kind of like the interview that has stuck out recently as something that was extremely interesting or different from the usual?
Well, we publish the podcast every single Monday. There's a Boston guest, and then Thursday for a New York guest. All of them have their own little nuggets of gold, to be honest with you. And that's what I love about the podcast, is just to interview so many great people. It's mainly founders, CEOs, and investors. But I guess I'm going to pick from the podcast we published today. So it's Stephanie Manning, who's director of platform at Lara Hippo, which is the most active seed investment firm in New York City. So Stephanie and I had a very deep discussion on how to land a job in venture capital. So she has this career path that took her from A to director of platform for a well-respected VC firm in New York. And we just had a great conversation that kind of gives someone the inside look of what the career path could look like, because there's different ways to enter the venture capital industry, but it's not really well known out there of how someone gets a job on the platform team or the investment team. So that was a lot of fun. On Monday, I talked to Rebecca Liebman, who's the co-founder and CEO of LearnLux. Talk about someone who I admire. She is just a passionate go-getter who knows how to network so incredibly well. And I think she's just accomplished so much with her company. And if you see the people that she's raised capital from, it's Ashton Kutcher, Guy Oseary, Mark Benioff. I mean, these are like, people that are incredibly well known, and to have her, those individuals backing her company is just saying a lot about her.
That's awesome, man. That's really cool. And how do you go about, there's so many interesting people in Boston, New York. How do you go about choosing the ones you want to talk to?
I always try to make sure that there's a story to be told. There's certainly, I admire all entrepreneurs. It's incredibly hard to build a company. But, for our audience, there needs to be something there, not just the story of building a company. So I look for generally founders that are doing something unique or special with their company, or people that have had, multiple layers of success where they can talk about their work as a whole. Because the general format's going to be the person's background, the details on their current company and what they're building and the scale of what they're building, and then general advice afterwards. So advice on how to raise capital or how to, hire, which is, something that always, people always can use feedback on. So I just try to make sure that there's a compelling story for our guest. And, the Guy Raz, who started, How I Built This for NPR, he's my mentor. He doesn't know this formally because I've never met him, but I, last summer I was, remodeling my basement. So that meant I spent a lot of time painting. And I think I went through every single episode of How I Built This. And it's just such an amazing podcast. So
it is.
Yeah. So that's kind of the one that I've mimicked.
Great, man. That's excellent. In terms of the general job search world, how do you think it's changed? And let me put a quick anecdotal episode to you. Going back to Indeed, I asked about Indeed before. And so I recently put up some job postings on Indeed, and what I've noticed that kind of struck me is they are a sponsor type of platform, right? So you put up a job, you could choose to put it up at no cost, or you could sponsor each of these postings pay-per-click style. So I did that, and when I turned it on, I got a phone call like 5 minutes later from someone. I didn't pick up the phone, but I saw it was Indeed, and then they emailed me, and I corresponded via email just because I don't have much time to talk on the phone. And then after a little while, I got a bunch of candidates. I turned off I paused the job, and literally 5 minutes later, I get a call again from Indeed. I didn't pick up the call, and then they emailed me after. So they have this pretty sales intensive process, and I certainly wasn't one of their biggest customers, I don't think. So that was like a little different than what I was kind of used to. But I wanted to ask you, how do you think, is this kind of the norm now with this aggressive sales tactics, or how has the recruiting process changed since you've started?
Well, I think if your question is about Indeed as a business, like how they operate, they're a company that is very large and at scale, and their business ultimately sold for a big number. So I would relate Indeed to a modern day version of Monster, where Monster was just I want to say aggressive, because that kind of depends on the person that's on the other end of their sales tactic, but they had a very large sales force that was focused on selling Monster job postings and all their other services to companies of all sizes and stages. And I would get pinged from the rep from monster.com all the time of having Dissero post jobs or using their resume database. So I think Indeed just a modern day version of that, where they have a very large sales force and you have hungry sales reps that are trying to make money.
Gotcha. And as far as just the overall process, I mean, do you think that it's changed since you started? I mean, are there still recruiters calling on candidates, or is it more of the opposite today? I mean, how has the process changed?
Well, you brought up an interesting point of you would get the phone call yet you didn't pick up. I think that's probably one of the biggest pieces that has changed. So when I started recruiting in 1998, literally my manager would give me the directories of all the big 5 consulting firms. So I had the person's name and their phone number, and I would just sit there and dial 60 numbers a day because they tracked our phone calls, and it was just cold calling and mainly leaving voicemail messages because most of those people were traveling to a client site. So doing the phone blitz strategy, I think, is something that's really hard to do. A lot of companies don't even have a phone system, so you're not going to have access to their mobile number. So I think things like LinkedIn has helped connect and bridge the gap for recruiters that are trying to get a hold of great candidates. But I think that's probably the biggest piece that has changed as far as actually getting a hold of people. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're a good recruiter, the craft in itself hasn't changed. It's going to be all about networking and just continuing to be really good at what you do, where someone sees value of you as a service provider, whether if it's a company that's looking to engage with a search firm to help out, or on the flip side of candidates that are looking towards you to be an advisor for your career or their career. So I think that's that has never changed. It's heavily a relationship-driven business, as is most service-based operations.
Is it still sort of the buyer's market, the job seekers market in the tech space specifically? If we talk about Boston or New York, or have things changed?
Yeah, I mean, knock on wood, right now it's still a candidate-driven market. They kind of are in control of there's plenty of opportunities. I mean, right now there's over 3,700 jobs listed on VentureFizz, and that's across all functional areas. It's not just engineering. Yes, engineers are super hard to find and hire, but product management, sales, marketing, user experience, those are all other functional areas that it's just as difficult to find great talent. So this is the problem we want to have, because when it's the inverse, that means we're in an economic downturn. So in 2001, 2002, after the dot-com bubble burst, that was a time frame where there was plenty of people, not enough jobs. And then the same thing happened in 2008, 2009 after the financial collapse, where it just, every industry was affected, not just the tech industry, but luckily
Right.
the tech industry rebounded a lot faster. So it is a good problem to have, supply and demand, where there's not enough people for the jobs available.
So I read a lot about, the current macroeconomic situation, and some people are saying, we're at the top of the market. Things are there isn't too much higher. We're talking about like not just the stock market, but just the market in general, the economy in the United States. And I think that the job recruiting space is a great kind of leading indicator. So you're saying you haven't really seen anything that would indicate any kind of downward pressure on the job market?
Nothing yet. I think everyone is aware that, wow, it's been a great ride in the tech industry for a long period of time. So every so often you will hear about discussions of a bubble and things starting to tone back a bit. I have seen some blog posts from some venture capitalists advising people to be conservative, right? Valuations maybe aren't as frothy as they were a couple of years ago. I don't know. I'm not into the numbers of valuations, but I think like any economic cycle, if you're building a company of value and there's a need for what you do, you can survive in any economic condition. But knock on wood, I'm not ready for another 2008, 2009. I'll tell you that much. That was rough.
Yeah, my personal opinion, I don't think we're going to see another episode like that. I mean, I think that if anything, the market has been going up for a long time. There has been a lot of expansion. A lot of it's been driven by sort of printing money, if you will, and bond buybacks and things like that are a little bit beyond our control on a entrepreneurship level. But I think that if anything, we might see a correction in the market, which might be totally healthy, and then we'll continue to expand from there. It's good to know that the job market is still continuing to be as strong as it has been, and I think that Boston and New York, the two places where you operate, have been uniquely strong. And I mean, it's San Francisco, Boston, New York are kind of the three cities where startups happen for the most part, though it's looking like it's expanding throughout the country now. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's sort of the three cities still, or is it kind of changing nowadays?
I think you find pockets of tech hubs throughout the country. I've been hearing more and more is happening in Florida, which I never historically heard about. Atlanta, like MailChimp is down there, and there's been other companies that have had exits. Same thing in Austin, Chicago. Obviously, Seattle is a massive hub, so LA is massive. So when I think of the massive ones, it's Boston, New York, the Valley, which includes lots of massive areas, plus LA and Seattle. Those are probably the five that, from what I've learned, are probably the largest. But then you have kind of the secondary markets that are thriving and also doing well, like Austin, Boulder, Colorado, Chicago, DC, in Florida, Atlanta. So there's pockets of innovation going on in lots of different areas, which is exciting. There's ample opportunity. I think the biggest limiting factor for some geographical areas that are looking to build more of a high growth engine place to build a startup or a company is access to capital and access to talent. So I've seen in other geographies, they just don't have the investors locally that are going to hear their idea and write a seed angel check to get it started to the point where they need an A round, or they don't have the right types of people that are going to jump into a startup and know how to build a product from day one.
Absolutely. So let's talk about New York and Boston a little bit. So you focus on these two cities, and you yourself, you live in Philly. Have you always lived in Philly, or?
No, I'm originally from New Hampshire. I grew up there. I lived in Hooksett, New Hampshire, went to high school in Manchester, and post-college, I lived in Boston, kind of bounced around between Malden, Newburyport, and Southie, but met my wife, who was also a recruiter, so we met at work, and she went to Providence College, so we met in Boston. She's originally from the Philly area, so we moved to the Philly area about 13 years ago. So I've been doing everything remote over the past 13 years, and it always throws people a curveball because they're like, "Hey, let's grab coffee," and I'm like, "Well, it's kind of hard to do that." So it's worked out just fine. I come up to Boston frequently for events and meetings, and then New York is a very easy train ride for me now.
Right. No, Philly's a great city. I love Philly. But how did you? I mean, did you start out with Boston as the first city on your platform, and then add New York? How did that work out?
Yeah, Boston's where my bread and butter of my relationships and network has been for several years, 20 somewhat years now. So VentureFizz started with the Boston market, and just continued to grow. And when I put my search firm on hold, that was to focus on scaling VentureFizz into other markets. So being that New York is such a large tech hub and it's relatively up the street from me, it just made sense to launch there as a second market. So it's been a lot of fun learning what's going on in New York. I did dip my toes in the New York market a few years back. So I started doing some search work there, was helping out Rent the Runway and Birchbox and Pixable in their early days. But we got so busy in Boston, it was really hard to do what we did from the search point of view in both markets. But with VentureFizz, we expanded to New York back in June of last year. So that's been a lot of fun, getting to know a lot of the investors, founders, and PR firms there.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And as far as the tech scene that you see going on right now in Boston, New York, I mean, are there new areas that are sort of that you find interesting and that are kind of potentially driving job growth and innovation growth in these cities and beyond? Probably, I don't think it's limited to Boston, New York, but are there new areas, maybe blockchain or fintech? I don't know. What are you seeing these days as far as where the concentration of companies are kind of gravitating towards?
I see a broad spectrum, although there are newer technologies like, AI, and you mentioned blockchain, that, machine learning, that you're seeing a lot of emphasis around in companies that are developing a solution that leverages one of those types of technologies. But I think what's really interesting about Boston and New York is the wide range of companies that are being developed. So in Boston, people always say, "Oh, you can't build a consumer company in Boston." Yet some of the largest consumer companies that are publicly traded, like Wayfair and TripAdvisor, are Boston-based. Kayak, the heart of Kayak is built in Cambridge. The products and engineering and user experience is all Boston-based. Their sales and executives are, based in Connecticut, but the heart of Kayak is Boston. And then you've got really interesting hardware and robotics companies in Boston, autonomous driving. And in New York, there's also, it's not just fintech, it's not just ad tech or, digital media. There's so much diverse number of companies that are being built there, like MongoDB went public. You've got so many great consumer companies there. So I think what's exciting about both regions is the fact that there's a tremendous amount of companies being built in so many, a broad spectrum. It's just not that they're good at one thing.
Gotcha. If you had to choose, though, if you thought about what the different, tech innovation, areas are, and choose one or two, what would you say defines Boston, and what would you say defines New York?
I would have to think long and hard about that because it is so diverse in my opinion. But, Boston's always been known for B2B. I mean, I think if, marketing, so MarTech, software is super, super deep with, HubSpot and so many folks that have gone off from, HubSpot and started other companies. There's just pockets of everything. So that's kind of a lame answer for you. So it's, but I think that's what's exciting about it. There's so much diverse, different types of companies and products. It's not just enterprise software in Boston or infrastructure and storage, right? That's kind of the old EMC mantra that Boston used to carry. It's so much, broader than that now, which is great. Maybe that's also a detriment. I mean, I think, if you're a consumer company that has a focus on being a fashion brand, you probably should be in New York. If your startup really counts on leveraging ecosystems like Facebook or LinkedIn, you should probably be in the Valley. So I think there's strengths in both regions from Boston and New York that is very broad.
No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think New York has that, because of Wall Street, it has that fintech, and because of like Madison Avenue, ad tech and fashion, all of that stuff is a little more New York-ish. However, it's not impossible to build in Boston either. And nowadays with the remote, everyone, or a lot of companies are doing remote working. You can have people in Boston, you can have people in New York quite easily. And so I think that's all totally possible. What do you?
You know what? I'm gonna now. I was thinking about I think where Boston is really crushing it right now is hard tech. You look at some of the companies that are getting funded and what the Engine and Katie and what she's doing with the MIT fund. It's just really amazing types of long form investing, not short term hit mobile app stuff. It's really hard. Path AI, companies like that are just really making an impact to hopefully our society or how we live or how we're treated. Healthcare, that type of stuff. So I think that's Boston's known for hard tech, and that continues to really resonate as a brand for the location.
Yeah, and biotech is really strong as well, right?
Which I don't talk about that too much because that's not my world. I can't really get into the weeds of all these amazing biotech companies and what they're building. But yeah, that's incredible. And you see a lot of those companies getting acquired or going public at incredible multiples for investors.
Yeah, definitely. If you're a young person right now, not saying that you're old, but if you're really young, like coming out of college, right? And you're thinking about a career in tech, where would you think? Where would you tell your younger self to look if you're going that route?
Well, I think I would, I would definitely look to join a startup at some, you can kind of go two different ways. One, you could go join a larger company for a couple of years just to kind of get your, feet wet in the whole world of working. And then I would quickly parlay that into a job in a startup. Or if you do have the ability to join a startup, coming straight out of school, maybe because you interned at one or it just kind of works out for you. I was always the biggest advocate of joining startups. It was kind of self-serving because that was my client base, but it was something that I truly believed that someone, what they're going to learn 2 to 5 years in a startup compared to at a larger company was just astronomically greater. And what people always have to think about when they're managing their careers is how are they keeping themselves marketable. So in any economic cycle, whether it's a good economy or a bad one, are you employable? So the people that were focused on keeping their marketability at a very high rate because they were pushing themselves and learning lots of things continuously and pushing their career forward, those people were not looking for jobs, or if they were, they didn't look for long in the 2008, 2009 time period. So it's always trying to push the envelope for what you want to do. And then the other thing, I have 2 daughters, and I am constantly instilling a thought of starting their own company. So entrepreneurship, because I'm talking to these people all day long, is something that I'm trying to instill into their mindset and DNA that, at some point I hope they run their own companies.
Very interesting. One final question for you before we go.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to choose a company in Boston or New York, what would be your favorite for innovation or most interesting company that you choose right now?
Well, that's like asking me which child I like better, because they're all amazing. So we have 250 somewhat customers that are leveraging our BIZZpages as a way to engage with our audience. So that's really hard to say. You know what? I'm going to pick a company, if I can, Kirill, that isn't Boston, New York based.
Okay, sure.
So I think Zoom, because of what I do, I think Zoom has really transformed, and I think they've done a great job with their brand. Jay Acunzo did a podcast with, I think it was their chief marketing officer. And when I heard this background story on Zoom, I don't know if this is correct, but I think it was one of the people that started, what was the video conferencing company that Cisco had acquired, like WebEx or something like that. I forget.
Yes, WebEx was the one.
Okay, so here's the individual that was pretty much leading engineering at WebEx. They get acquired by Cisco. He's managing 1,000 engineers and so much like resources and budget at their capacity to make an amazing product. Yet he got so frustrated with what was being done. He was like, you know what, I can do this better and can do it on my own. And I think Zoom, what they have done as far as the ability for someone like me to live in Pennsylvania and stay so connected to my customers in Boston and New York at the distance that I am, it's just amazing. And to have face-to-face conversations and not having to get on a plane immediately to go see someone. What I love about the product, because there are other ones out there, is the fact that it just works and it's always easy to use. It has the right features and functionality. So that Zoom's a company that I think of as far as it's just that the brand that they've built and a product that is similar to how Apple operates. It just works.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. We're actually using their product right now to record this podcast, and I use it all the time myself. I think they've done great with branding. They've done great with the product design, and it's really cool. All right, man. It was great talking to you, Keith. I really appreciate it. We're going to put up some links to VentureFizz and to some of your other pages, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks for your time. This is awesome.
Thank you.